The morning sun rose over Guadalcanal in early September 1942, casting its harsh light across a jungle-strewn island that had suddenly become the center of a global struggle. For the men of the U.S. Marines, this was not just another battle. It was a fight for control of Henderson Field, an airstrip that had already changed the balance of power in the Pacific. Captured just weeks earlier, the airfield allowed Allied aircraft to strike at Japanese positions across the Solomon Islands, threatening supply lines and challenging Japan's push to dominate the region. Its importance was undeniable, and the Japanese High Command was determined to take it back, no matter the cost. Among the Marines on Guadalcanal, there was a sense of both fear and determination. The island was hostile, a labyrinth of dense jungle, ridges, and swamps, and the Japanese forces were experienced and ruthless. Rumors spread of thousands of enemy troops preparing for a major assault. Yet in the midst of this tension, one officer was quietly planning a gamble that would soon make history. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt "Red Mike" Edson, a battle-hardened Marine, understood the stakes. He knew that the ridge just south of Henderson Field could be held if the Marines were positioned correctly, and that bold, decisive action could prevent the Japanese from regaining the airfield. The ridge itself was a treacherous stretch of high ground, overlooking both the airfield and the jungle approaches. It was a natural choke point, a place where a smaller force could hold off a much larger enemy. Edson studied the terrain carefully. Every contour, every thicket, every narrow path was analyzed. He planned to place his men in a tight defensive perimeter, maximizing their firepower while minimizing the chances of being overrun. Intelligence reports estimated that roughly 2,500 Japanese troops were approaching, vastly outnumbering his 800 Marines. For many commanders, retreat might have seemed the safer option, but Edson saw an opportunity to turn the enemy's strength into a vulnerability. As the sun climbed higher, Marines moved into position, setting up machine guns on ridge lines, digging foxholes, and laying improvised mortar positions. Every weapon was carefully sighted to create interlocking fields of fire, and every Marine was briefed on the plan. The atmosphere was tense but focused. There was no room for hesitation. Edson walked among his men, checking positions, offering encouragement, and emphasizing the importance of discipline. In the dense jungle, it was impossible to see far ahead, but the Marines knew that any gap in the line could be fatal. Meanwhile, Japanese troops were advancing through the night, silently moving through the jungle toward the ridge. Their strategy relied on overwhelming numbers, but the terrain worked against them. Narrow paths funneled their forces, forcing them into kill zones where the Marines' carefully positioned machine guns and mortars would be deadly. Edson had anticipated this, and the defensive layout was designed to make the Japanese assault costly and chaotic. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test the courage and resolve of every man on both sides. As the day progressed, small skirmishes broke out. Scouts reported Japanese patrols probing the perimeter, testing for weaknesses. Each engagement was a tense exchange of fire, brief but violent, providing glimpses of the intensity to come. Edson remained calm, knowing that these minor clashes were only the prelude to the main assault. He reinforced his positions, moving reserves where they were most needed, and preparing his men for the night ahead. The ridge would become a crucible, and he understood that the outcome would depend not only on tactics, but on the courage of his Marines under extreme pressure. By late afternoon, the sun was beginning its descent, and shadows stretched across the jungle. The sounds of the island, the calls of unseen birds, the rustle of leaves, the distant roar of waves, mixed with the tense whispers of soldiers preparing for combat. Edson gathered his officers and reminded them of the plan. Hold the ridge at all costs, maintain tight formations, use the terrain to their advantage, and coordinate firepower precisely. Every man knew that retreat was not an option, and the discipline of the unit would be their greatest asset. As darkness fell, the ridge took on a foreboding character. Shapes of trees and undergrowth became indistinct shadows, and the jungle seemed alive with movement. The Marines waited in silence, listening to the sounds of the approaching enemy. Every branch snap, every distant shout sent a jolt of tension through the ranks. They were about to face an assault by a force more than 3 times their number, but Edson's confidence and meticulous planning had given them a chance. The night would soon descend into chaos, and the ridge would become a battlefield where courage, strategy, and determination would decide the fate of Henderson Field and the future of the Guadalcanal campaign. In the quiet moments before the storm, Edson walked along the line one final time. He spoke quietly to his men, reminding them that their fight was not just for survival, but for the strategic lifeline the airfield represented. The Japanese were advancing, the jungle seemed to hold its breath, and history waited on that ridge. What happened next would be remembered as a moment when a small, disciplined force defied overwhelming odds and set the stage for a battle that would become legendary in Marine Corps history. As night approached on Guadalcanal, the tension among the Marines deepened. Lieutenant Colonel Edson knew that the Japanese would not waste time. Intelligence reports had tracked columns of enemy troops moving through the dense jungle, their numbers estimated at over 2,500. Each man in Edson's 800-strong force understood they were outnumbered more than 3 to 1. Yet instead of retreating or spreading his men thin across the ridge, Edson made a calculated decision that would define the battle. He chose to consolidate his Marines into a tighter defensive perimeter, turning what seemed like a trap into an opportunity to maximize firepower. The ridge itself was treacherous, with steep slopes, dense undergrowth, and narrow pathways winding through the jungle. Edson and his officers moved swiftly to assign positions. Machine guns were placed on the high points, able to sweep the approaches with overlapping fields of fire. Mortar teams were carefully sighted to hit likely avenues of enemy advance. Every foxhole was dug to provide cover and a stable firing position, every line of sight calculated to create kill zones. Edson insisted that the perimeter remain tight, that no gaps exist through which the Japanese could penetrate. The Marines worked tirelessly as the sun dipped below the horizon. The jungle was oppressive, thick with humidity and the scent of wet earth. Sweat ran down faces under the weight of helmets and gear, yet there was no complaint. Each man knew that the hours ahead could determine not only their survival, but the fate of Henderson Field. Scouts returned with reports of enemy patrols, some glimpsed only in fleeting shadows between trees. Edson listened carefully, then adjusted positions. Every report became a vital piece of the puzzle, informing where reserves were needed, where additional firepower could be brought to bear. Edson's planning extended beyond just positioning. He organized his forces for rapid communication and coordination. Runners were assigned to carry messages, hand signals were rehearsed, and prearranged signals would allow artillery from Henderson Field to strike accurately without friendly fire. He knew that if the Japanese approached under darkness, confusion could turn into catastrophe unless every Marine knew exactly where to fire and when to hold their line. The psychological component of the defense was as important as the physical. Edson addressed his men, reminding them that the ridge was more than a piece of terrain. It was the key to keeping Henderson Field in Allied hands. He spoke of the importance of discipline, of trusting one another, and of staying calm under pressure. The Marines were tired, having already endured days of combat and harsh conditions, but Edson's confidence and steady presence inspired them. They understood that their training, their courage, and their cohesion would be the difference between survival and annihilation. As darkness engulfed the jungle, the first signs of the Japanese approach became evident. The rustling of leaves, the snapping of twigs, and distant voices echoed faintly through the trees. Edson had predicted these movements, and his troops were ready. The perimeter held tight, each machine gun crew scanning the shadows, mortars primed to strike. Edson walked along the lines, checking that everyone was in position,
offering encouragement where fear threatened to take hold. Every Marine understood that the ridge was a narrow funnel. The Japanese, despite their numbers, would be forced to advance through zones where concentrated fire could be devastating. By now, the ridge was alive with anticipation. Patrols exchanged occasional fire, testing reactions, but the Marines remained disciplined, returning controlled bursts that inflicted casualties and confusion. Edson kept reserves in the center of the perimeter, ready to reinforce any threatened section. This careful planning meant that the Japanese, expecting an easy flanking maneuver, would instead encounter an unexpected wall of resistance. Every aspect of Edson's plan was designed to turn the enemy's numerical advantage into a vulnerability. The hours passed, and the night grew darker, the jungle almost impenetrable. Edson and his men were poised on the edge of what would soon become the fiercest combat of the Guadalcanal campaign. The ridge was no longer just high ground, it was a trap, a crucible that would test the limits of strategy, courage, and endurance. Every decision made during this tense preparation would be magnified in the chaos to come. The Marines waited silently, knowing that any misstep could cost them their lives, but confident that their careful planning, the terrain, and Edson's leadership would give them a chance to hold the line against overwhelming odds. In the quiet moments before the Japanese assault, Edson surveyed the perimeter one last time. His men were ready, their weapons primed, their spirits steel. The enemy was approaching in force, unaware of the trap that awaited them. The gamble had been made. By consolidating his troops into a tighter defensive formation, Edson had chosen to stand and fight rather than retreat. The ridge would become a testing ground for courage, strategy, and the brutal realities of jungle warfare. The coming night would reveal whether this bold, calculated decision could turn the tide or whether the Marines of Edson's command would be overwhelmed by sheer numbers.
Night fell over Guadalcanal like a heavy, suffocating blanket, cloaking the jungle in darkness that was both friend and enemy. For the 800 Marines on Edson's Ridge, the night ahead would test every ounce of courage, every skill they had honed in training, and every ounce of trust they had in one another. The Japanese forces, far more numerous, were moving with deadly purpose through the jungle, their objective clear: take the ridge and reclaim Henderson Field. Yet the Marines, meticulously positioned and fully aware of the stakes, were prepared to meet them. The first sounds of movement were faint: a snapping twig, the rustle of leaves, a whispered command from the enemy somewhere in the shadows. Edson had anticipated this. His men remained silent, tense, scanning the darkness with trained eyes. Spotlights from Henderson Field had not yet illuminated the ridge, but moonlight struggled through the canopy, casting shifting shadows that made every tree and bush appear alive. The Marines waited patiently, knowing that the first Japanese probes would be only the beginning. Then came the first clash. Japanese scouts pushed through a narrow approach, only to encounter the concentrated fire of machine guns placed along the high ground. The effect was immediate and devastating. The jungle erupted in bursts of gunfire, the flash of muzzles cutting through the darkness. Cries and shouts echoed among the trees as the enemy attempted to press forward. Edson's men had been trained for this moment: controlled fire, suppressing the advance, holding positions until the attackers were forced into kill zones. Each carefully coordinated volley exacted a toll on the advancing troops, slowing their momentum and sowing confusion. Amid the chaos, Edson moved along the lines, a steady presence in the storm of noise and flashes. He was a figure of calm authority, shouting encouragement, issuing orders, and adjusting positions as necessary. Mortar crews fired in rapid succession, sending explosive shells into the thick of enemy formations. Every shot was calculated, every movement deliberate. In the confined jungle paths, the Japanese could not maneuver effectively, and the Marines exploited this to maximum effect. The enemy pressed forward with determination, but each advance was met with carefully laid traps of interlocking fire. Hand-to-hand fighting erupted where Japanese troops managed to breach the outer perimeter. In the darkness, Combat became chaotic and brutal. Marines swung rifles as clubs, knives flashed, and the cries of wounded and dying filled the air. In these moments, individual bravery was magnified. Small teams held sections of the line, while neighboring squads reinforced them. Despite exhaustion and fear, the Marines remained disciplined, each man understanding the importance of maintaining cohesion. A single breach could unravel the entire defensive effort, and Edson's command ensured that no gap was left unguarded. Throughout the night, small flares and illumination rounds from Henderson Field lit sections of the ridge, revealing the devastation inflicted on the attackers. The Japanese forces were forced to slow their advance, reorganizing in pockets as Marines fired from concealed positions. The terrain itself became a weapon. Steep slopes, dense foliage, and narrow paths restricted enemy movement while providing the Marines with commanding positions. Edson's foresight in choosing a tighter perimeter had created a deadly funnel. The Japanese could not bring their numerical advantage to bear effectively. Communication was critical. Runners dashed between positions, shouting warnings, relaying orders, and coordinating artillery fire. Edson had established prearranged signals for targeting, ensuring that mortars and artillery struck precisely without endangering friendly troops. The coordination between the ridge defenders and Henderson Field proved decisive. Each shell that landed in the jungle sent waves of shock and disruption through the Japanese ranks, forcing them to regroup under intense pressure. By the middle of the night, it became clear that the enemy's initial momentum had been blunted. Fatigue was setting in, yet there was no room for rest. The Marines rotated as best they could, keeping guns manned and mortars loaded. Japanese attacks continued in waves, probing for weaknesses, attempting flanking maneuvers, and testing the limits of the defensive line. Each time, the Marines responded with deadly efficiency. Despite exhaustion, the cohesion of Edson's unit never wavered. Every man understood that the ridge had to be held, and that their survival and the control of Henderson Field depended on it. Edson himself remained constantly in motion, walking along the line, inspecting positions, and personally rallying men where the fighting was heaviest. His presence was both practical and symbolic, a reminder that leadership was not distant but engaged in the fight. The Marines trusted him, and that trust was reflected in their unwavering determination. As the night deepened, the Japanese assaults became more desperate, more ferocious, yet the tight perimeter, combined with interlocking fields of fire, precise artillery, and unbroken morale, held firm. By the early hours of the morning, the first night of the battle had taken a terrible toll. The Japanese had lost hundreds of men, their attacks repeatedly repelled. The ridge had proven its value as a defensive position, and Edson's gamble, allowing the enemy to almost surround his force but consolidating into a tight perimeter, was paying off. The Marines had survived the night, and the Japanese, though numerous and determined, had failed to seize the high ground. The first night had been a trial by fire, a brutal test of leadership, training, and courage under extreme conditions. As dawn approached, a cautious quiet settled over the ridge. The jungle was scarred by the chaos of battle. Burned vegetation, shattered trees, and the fallen of both sides lay scattered among the foliage. The Marines remained vigilant, aware that the Japanese would regroup and attempt a new assault. Edson took stock of his positions, tending to the wounded, reorganizing defenses, and preparing for the next wave. The ridge had survived the night, but the coming hours would demand even more courage, strategy, and endurance. The first night of combat on Edson's Ridge had demonstrated the power of discipline, planning, and leadership. Against overwhelming odds, a smaller, determined force had held firm, turning the terrain and careful preparation into a formidable weapon. The Japanese had underestimated the Marines, and their miscalculation would shape the battles to come. Edson's Ridge was no longer just a stretch of high ground. It had become a symbol of resilience, tactical brilliance, and the fierce determination that would define the Guadalcanal campaign.
Night fell over Edson's Ridge for the second time, heavier this night than the last, carrying with it a sense of inevitability. The Japanese had regrouped after their first failed assault, and their commanders were determined to capture the ridge at any cost. The Marines, despite exhaustion, were alert and ready. Every man knew that the next few hours could decide not only the battle for the ridge, but the fate of Henderson Field and the air campaign across the Solomons. Edson's gamble had brought them this far, but it would be tested to its absolute limits. The Japanese approached under darkness once more, their movements deliberate and measured. They sought to exploit any weakness, probing edges of the perimeter, trying to find a gap through which to pour their overwhelming numbers. Edson's men were ready. Machine guns swept the narrow paths, cutting down attackers before they could advance. Mortars fired high and precise, exploding among dense jungle cover, disrupting formations and sowing confusion. Artillery from Henderson Field, coordinated through prearranged signals, pounded the enemy positions, illuminating the jungle in flashes that made it impossible for Japanese troops to hide or maneuver. The Marines held a tight, overlapping perimeter. Every machine gun nest, every rifle position was placed to cover its neighbor, creating zones of crossfire that funneled the attackers into deadly areas. The Japanese, expecting to surround the Marines and crush them, were instead funneled into a meticulously planned trap. As each wave advanced, they were met with a coordinated hail of bullets, explosive mortar fire, and devastating artillery. The noise of combat was relentless, a storm of gunfire, explosions, and shouting that echoed through the jungle and over the ridge. Edson moved continuously along the line, a calm figure in the chaos. He checked positions, adjusted overlapping fields of fire, and reinforced sections under the heaviest attack. Where one machine gunner faltered from exhaustion, another stepped into place. Where a mortar crew needed support, Edson dispatched reinforcements from the reserve. His leadership was tireless, and the Marines responded with equal determination. Even as fatigue weighed heavily on every man, the unity and discipline of the force remained unbroken. Japanese assaults became increasingly desperate. Large groups surged up the narrow approaches, attempting to break through with sheer numbers. The Marines unleashed concentrated crossfire, creating a wall of death that decimated their ranks. Mortars dropped explosive shells into jungle cover, sending debris and confusion through enemy formations. Artillery illuminated the battlefield, turning night into intermittent flashes of violence and chaos. Each attack was met with devastating resistance, and the enemy momentum began to collapse under the weight of well-coordinated fire. Amid the assault, hand-to-hand fighting erupted at points where Japanese soldiers managed to reach the perimeter. In these brutal encounters, Marines fought with rifles, bayonets, and knives. Edson's men, trained for discipline under extreme conditions, held their ground. Reinforcements were rushed to threatened points, and any attempt to push through was met with overwhelming firepower. The psychological impact on the Japanese was significant. Waves of men were cut down before they could gain traction, and confusion spread rapidly among their ranks. By midnight, the ridge had become a maelstrom of noise, movement, and violence. The jungle seemed alive with the flash of gunfire and the roar of artillery. Japanese commanders struggled to coordinate their troops under the punishing conditions, while the Marines maintained remarkable composure. Every sector of the perimeter had become a kill zone, and every Japanese advance was met with deadly precision. Edson's gamble, allowing the enemy to nearly encircle his position while consolidating into a tight perimeter, had created a tactical advantage that would now determine the outcome of the battle. As the night progressed, Japanese attacks became increasingly chaotic. Their formations broke under the relentless crossfire, morale faltered, and casualties mounted. The Marines, though weary, held fast, exploiting every advantage of terrain, firepower, and positioning. Artillery continued to pound the enemy from Henderson Field, and mortars dropped in perfect timing to strike concentrations of troops. Every action was synchronized to maximize the effect,
and every Marine understood their critical role in the defense. By the pre-dawn hours, it was clear that the Japanese assault was failing. Hundreds of enemy soldiers lay dead or wounded in the dense jungle, and those who survived were forced to retreat in disarray. The Marines, battered and exhausted, had held every position. The ridge had not only resisted overwhelming numbers, but had shattered the Japanese attack entirely. Edson's Ridge had become a symbol of how a smaller, disciplined force, when well-positioned and expertly led, could overcome enormous odds. In the moments before daylight, the ridge fell quiet, save for the moans of the wounded and the occasional call of a sentry. The Marines took stock of their positions, tending to the injured and reinforcing defenses in case of any renewed attack. The Japanese were retreating into the jungle, disorganized and demoralized. Over 700 of their soldiers had been killed, a staggering loss for what was intended to be a decisive offensive. The 800 Marines had survived, and more than survived, they had decisively defeated a numerically superior force, demonstrating the lethal effectiveness of leadership, strategy, and cohesion. The significance of this night could not be overstated. By holding the ridge, Edson's men had protected Henderson Field, ensuring that Allied aircraft could continue to dominate the skies over Guadalcanal and the surrounding islands. The Japanese, humbled by the loss, were forced into a defensive posture for the remainder of the campaign. Edson himself emerged as a legendary figure, his leadership, courage, and tactical brilliance a testament to the fighting spirit of the Marines. Edson's Ridge was more than a battlefield. It was a crucible that tested the limits of human endurance, strategy, and morale. The second night of combat had proven that calculated risk, meticulous planning, and unwavering discipline could turn a perilous situation into a historic victory. For the Marines, the ridge was a bitter, blood-soaked triumph, a reminder that courage under fire, unity of purpose, and intelligent use of terrain could defy the odds and alter the course of a campaign. As dawn broke over Guadalcanal, the ridge stood as a testament to what a determined few could accomplish against overwhelming force, a moment that would be remembered in Marine Corps history for generations.
The sun rose over Guadalcanal after the fury of 2 nights of combat, casting a harsh light over a battlefield marked by courage, blood, and determination. Edson's Ridge, once just a narrow stretch of high ground, now stood as a symbol of endurance and tactical brilliance. The 800 Marines who had held it against over 2,500 Japanese soldiers were exhausted, their uniforms torn, faces smeared with mud and sweat, yet their morale remained unbroken. Henderson Field, the strategic heart of the island, had been preserved, and with it, the balance of power in the Solomon Islands had shifted. The aftermath of the battle revealed the staggering cost for the Japanese. Hundreds of their soldiers lay dead or wounded among the dense jungle and broken trees. Their assaults had been relentless, but the disciplined fire of the Marines, combined with precise artillery and mortar support, had shattered their offensive completely. Japanese commanders were forced to acknowledge that the ridge was not just a line of defense, but a calculated stronghold designed to maximize the effectiveness of every Marine under Edson's command. For the survivors, the retreat was chaotic and demoralizing, a bitter reminder that sheer numbers alone could not overcome careful planning, preparation, and unity of purpose. For the Marines, the battle was no less grueling. They had endured hours of hand-to-hand fighting, constant artillery and mortar bombardment, and the psychological strain of facing an enemy that outnumbered them 3-1. Yet through it all, the men had held fast. They had demonstrated extraordinary courage under fire, maintained discipline when chaos reigned, and relied on the leadership of Lieutenant Colonel Edson to guide them through the darkest hours of the night. Their sacrifice ensured that Henderson Field remained operational, allowing Allied aircraft to continue to strike Japanese positions and maintain supply lines across the region. The victory at Edson's Ridge was immediately recognized as a turning point in the Guadalcanal campaign. By holding the ridge, the Marines not only prevented the Japanese from recapturing Henderson Field, but also forced the enemy into a defensive posture. Japanese plans for a swift offensive had been decisively disrupted, and they were compelled to engage in attritional warfare under conditions that increasingly favored the defenders. The battle demonstrated that terrain, preparation, and leadership could offset numerical disadvantage, and that a well-led, disciplined force could shape the course of a larger campaign. Lieutenant Colonel Edson's role in the battle earned him immediate recognition. His decision to allow the enemy to almost encircle his forces, consolidating instead into a tight defensive perimeter, had been a calculated gamble that paid off spectacularly. Edson's leadership throughout the fight, moving along the lines under fire, reinforcing threatened positions, coordinating artillery and mortars, and inspiring his men to maintain discipline, became a case study in military strategy. His actions would earn him the Medal of Honor and secure his place in Marine Corps history as one of the most effective leaders of the Pacific War. Beyond individual heroism, Edson's Ridge demonstrated the effectiveness of combined arms in jungle warfare. Machine guns, mortars, artillery, and small unit tactics were integrated with the terrain to create a defensive network that amplified the fighting power of a smaller force. The Japanese, expecting to overwhelm the Marines with sheer numbers, found themselves funneled into kill zones where each advance was met with devastating fire. The success of the ridge would influence future operations in the Pacific, reinforcing the importance of terrain, interlocking fire, and coordinated defensive planning. The psychological impact of the battle was equally profound. For the Marines, the victory proved that courage, discipline, and teamwork could overcome seemingly insurmountable odds. For the Japanese, it became a cautionary tale. Numerical superiority alone could not guarantee success, and underestimating the determination and skill of the defenders could result in catastrophic losses. The battle instilled confidence among Allied forces on Guadalcanal, showing that even when outnumbered, careful planning, preparation, and leadership could tip the scales in favor of a smaller force. In the days following the battle, the ridge remained under Marine control. Casualties were treated, positions were reinforced, and the men prepared for the next inevitable engagement. The Japanese, having suffered severe losses, would continue to challenge Henderson Field, but the decisive defense at Edson's Ridge had fundamentally changed the dynamics of the campaign. The Marines had proven that disciplined, coordinated defense could not only survive overwhelming odds, but also inflict staggering losses on the enemy, setting a precedent for future operations across the Pacific theater. Edson's Ridge also became a symbol of Marine Corps identity and tradition. It was a testament to the principles of leadership, courage, and tactical ingenuity. Training manuals, after-action reports, and military histories would reference the ridge as a model for defensive operations in hostile terrain. The story of 800 men holding against 2,500 would inspire generations of Marines, emphasizing that preparation, unity, and resolve were as powerful as any weapon in their arsenal. As Guadalcanal itself became a prolonged and brutal campaign, the significance of the ridge continued to resonate. Henderson Field remained operational, allowing Allies to project air power across the Solomons, disrupt Japanese supply lines, and provide support to ground forces throughout the island. The failure of the Japanese to capture the ridge forced them to adjust their strategy, moving from aggressive assaults to attritional warfare that gradually favored the Allies. In this way, Edson's Ridge did more than survive 2 nights of combat. It shaped the strategic outcome of the entire Guadalcanal campaign. Ultimately, the legacy of Edson's Ridge is a story of calculated risk, leadership under fire, and the extraordinary resilience of ordinary soldiers.
800 Marines, standing shoulder to shoulder on a narrow stretch of jungle-high ground, had defied overwhelming odds and turned the tide of a critical campaign. Their determination and discipline ensured that Henderson Field remained in Allied hands, that Japanese ambitions were checked, and that the Pacific War continued with a renewed sense of possibility for the Allies. The ridge, scarred by bullets and mortar fire, stood as a silent witness to heroism, strategy, and the unyielding spirit of those who fought there.